They braced for disgrace, starvation, perhaps even execution. Japanese soldiers taken in the Pacific Theater had been taught by their own officers that surrender was a stain and that Americans knew no mercy. Ferried across the ocean to camps inside the continental United States, most were certain they would never again touch the ordinary habits of civilian life. Yet the first steps they took on American ground began to overturn everything they'd been told. Instead of being beaten or humiliated, they were processed like servicemen, names recorded, forms completed, and marched in neat columns toward vast compounds that looked less like penitentiaries and more like training installations. Even the intake contradicted expectations. Guards stayed firm, rifles at the ready, but there was no chaotic brutality. To their astonishment, new arrivals received rations immediately. Hot meals, sometimes bread and butter, coffee, even meat. In their minds, an enemy should have starved them into obedience. The US Army, however, ran under Geneva Convention rules, and American officers knew there was propaganda value in fair treatment. For Japanese POWs, this was the start of something they had not imagined. The camps themselves were an even greater surprise. Tall fences and barbed wire ringed the sites, yet inside stood rows of wooden barracks, kitchens, recreation spaces, and designated areas for work and study. Some compounds kept libraries with English books and magazines, others maintained ball fields where baseball or soccer would later be played. For men torn from island fighting, where disease and constant hunger framed every day, the shift felt unreal. They struggled to reconcile battlefield chaos with this orderly environment. The newcomers' mental state was fragile. Many were gaunt, battling malaria, or carrying untreated injuries. American medical teams examined them briskly, logging infections, wounds, and parasites. Being treated by the enemy confused them. Some resisted, expecting a trick. Others complied in silence, astonished that their lives mattered to their captors at all. What disoriented them most was not cruelty, but a kind of impersonal kindness, clinical, detached, and rule-bound. One of the earliest impressions was the sheer machinery of organization. American camps ran like precision instruments. Everything, from meal preparation to health checks, followed schedules. This rigidity contrasted with the make-do improvisation of Japanese garrisons, where shortages meant sewing one's own clothing, cutting each other's hair, and going weeks without proper washing. To Japanese prisoners, the American order felt foreign, almost indulgent. Even the scent of soap in the air cut sharply against a world they believed war had erased. Another jolt came from the leveling of status. Officers and enlisted men were processed together, sometimes shoulder to shoulder, without the strict social separations drilled into them at home. Americans had ranks, certainly, but when handling prisoners, procedure trumped ceremony. This subtle flattening unsettled Japanese officers unused to such treatment and hinted at a different sort of military discipline, less about unquestioning submission, more about mass administration. Rumors soon threaded through the barracks. Barbers would arrive, some said. Others claimed uniforms would be issued. Still others insisted laundry would be collected as in a normal town. At first these tales sounded like cruel jokes, yet a quiet realization crept in. America ran on systems the prisoners did not yet grasp. For men who equated surrender with degradation, being managed with order and discipline was the deepest surprise of all. In the days after arrival, they found captivity governed by rituals far from anything on the front. One of the starkest discoveries came with strict hygiene orders. Every man was to bathe regularly, shave on a timetable, and keep a neat appearance. For soldiers who had rationed water for drinking, daily washing felt absurdly extravagant. Still, guards enforced the rules, lining men up for inspections. The shock ran deeper than mere discomfort. Japanese military culture prized endurance. Filthy uniforms, unwashed bodies, and untreated wounds stood as badges of toughness. Imperial troops were praised for slogging through swamps, making do on scant rations, and wearing sweat-soaked clothing until it rotted. Cleanliness was not virtue, but a distraction from sacrifice. To be told suddenly to scrub one's body, trim nails, and maintain tidy hair collided with everything they'd learned. Showers became a first major adjustment. Many camps in America had large communal facilities with hot water, unheard of in the field. The sensation stayed with them, scalding water cutting through weeks of grime. the sharp smell of American soap, towels that were woven cloth, not rags. Supervision made some feel humiliated, but others began to link cleanliness with relief and even regain dignity. Shaving created another cultural scene. In campaign conditions, faces were rarely kept clean-shaven. Stubble and beards were marks of ruggedness. US regulations required smooth chins. Razors, often unfamiliar safety models, were issued along with instructions. The rule seemed odd, even pointless, until they noticed guards praising neat appearance after inspection. Grooming, they realized, functioned as discipline in the American system. Uniforms carried their own message. On arrival, many had been stripped of ruined field gear, boots coming apart, shirts in tatters from months in the jungle. In camp, they received plain but clean work clothes, usually cotton or denim, stamped PW in big letters. At first, this sameness felt degrading, a visible stamp of captivity. Over time, though, some acknowledged that these garments were laundered, mended, and replaced. Compared with wearing rags until they disintegrated, the difference was impossible to miss. Camp leadership insisted cleanliness was not kindness, but necessity. Disease could sweep a crowded barracks, and American officers meant to head off epidemics. Lice inspections became routine. Disinfectant powder dusted bedding and clothes. Those who balked were reminded compliance was about survival, not indulgence. Gradually, even the reluctant gave in. There was no escaping the regimen. What jarred prisoners most was not access to soap or water, but the American conviction that order rose from such routines. Hygiene served as an instrument of control, a discipline without whips or rifle butts. For men raised on an ethic of hardship and dirt, discovering that their captors considered tidiness part of military strength proved disorienting. Cleanliness, they came to see, was not weakness. It was authority expressed as regulation. By the time bathing and shaving became habitual, another surprise awaited them: organized barbershops inside the wire. Men who had hacked at each other's hair with knives, or simply let it grow wild, found dedicated rooms or corners of barracks outfitted with chairs, mirrors, and electric clippers. The first sessions were tense. Japanese soldiers sat rigid, fists tight, unsure whether the tools would be turned into punishment. Instead, the process proved routine. Guards watched while barbers, sometimes Americans, often trained fellow prisoners, cut hair neat and quick. For men who hadn't faced a mirror since leaving Japan, their reflections were startling. Clean faces, uniform haircuts, no longer the jungle-worn fighters of the Pacific. The ritual carried symbolic weight. In Japanese tradition, hair can hold spiritual meaning. The warrior's unkempt look could signal long struggle. Having one's hair tamed by an enemy felt humiliating at first. Slowly, practical benefits won out. Short hair meant fewer lice, less itching, and comfort in the heat. American officials emphasized these points. Good grooming lowered disease and kept camp life orderly. Barbershops also evolved into social nodes. Men waiting their turn murmured rumors about the war or watched transformations under the scissors. Some even competed for the sharpest cut, an irony not lost on observers. Later diaries would call these rooms strange islands of normalcy. One writer remembered sitting in the chair while baseball game sounds drifted in from outside, as if camp life moved to a rhythm unrelated to the raging war. To Americans, barbershops did more than clean heads. Grooming reinforced discipline. A closely shorn prisoner was easier to manage, visually unified, and less inclined to stand out. Orderly appearance dampened unrest by muting individualism. It also let the US Army display Geneva-compliant treatment if the Red Cross dropped by. There was an irony in who held the clippers. In some camps, Japanese barbers from civilian life were tapped to serve their peers, creating a tiny economy of skill and respect. A man who once cut hair in Osaka might find himself again at his trade, now under guard, shaping fellow captives rather than neighborhood customers, briefly reconnected to a civilian identity. What shocked many was not just the haircuts, but the surroundings: swept floors, polished mirrors, brushes, and scissors disinfected after each use. For men from foxholes where sanitation barely existed, the contrast was staggering. Each trip to the chair reminded them that their captors measured discipline not only in combat performance but in polished boots and trimmed hair. If barbershops upended expectations, the tailoring rooms confounded them further. In their own army, a uniform was issued and expected to last until it failed. Patches were crude, sewn from whatever scraps could be scrounged. Ragged clothing became a badge of endurance. Discovering that Americans would carefully repair and maintain prisoner garments felt incomprehensible. Many US camps, however, had tailoring sections staffed by quartermasters or skilled POWs equipped with tools, bolts of cloth and thread. The first encounter might be a guard collecting torn trousers and returning them days later with tight, precise stitching. Some prisoners turned the fabric over and over in disbelief. Why would an enemy spend time mending a captive's clothes instead of leaving him to rags? Over time, they learned it was systemic. Items were logged, repaired, and cycled back in patterns that made camp life resemble a civic institution more than a penal colony. The system was practical, but it also carried meaning. Standard work clothes stamped PW erased former identities and, oddly, created a sense of equality. Officers once decorated with insignia now wore the same sturdy garments as enlisted men. For a hierarchy that tied honor to uniforms, this was a subtle blow. Americans treated clothing as function and hygiene, not status. For some, the tailoring shop became a chance, not a slight. Men with sewing or textile backgrounds were assigned inside and given electric machines, racks of thread, and well-lit benches. Captivity, paradoxically, returned them to civilian work. Memoirs note that such assignments often brought modest advantages: warmer indoor labor, occasional extra rations, and a small purpose within the routine. Seasonal issue added another surprise. Unlike the tropics where they had shivered in thin rags, camps in the Midwest or South required winter kit. Jackets, caps, gloves, and heavier trousers appeared, astonishing men who had once suffered frostbite in poor gear. Red Cross parcels sometimes added socks, scarves, or patching fabric. Prisoners gradually recognized that their captors invested effort not merely to keep them alive, but to uphold standards set by international law. The work extended beyond uniforms. Curtains might be stitched for barracks windows, bedding repaired, even makeshift flags for sports days produced in the shop. This versatility impressed men used to improvising with scraps of canvas or rope. They began to see that American order rested not on enduring scarcity, but on systems designed to prevent it. At first, the operation looked lavish, even decadent. Why repair an enemy's clothes? Why spend energy on details? Weeks turned to months, and the neat stacks of mended garments in storerooms became emblems of efficiency and discipline. Bewilderment slowly shaded into reluctant respect. Tailoring was not charity. It was another expression of control and organization. The same shift played out with laundry. In their own ranks, washing came last, if at all. Uniforms were rinsed in rivers or not washed for months, fabric rotting from sweat and mud. On lonely islands, men wore one set until it fell apart. Entering a camp where clothes were collected, washed and returned on schedule felt beyond imagining. The process itself amazed them. Laundry days were fixed, bags marked with prisoner numbers were gathered, sometimes by truck, and taken to central plants. Inside, steam-powered machines thumped, the air thick with the scent of soap and hot water. Men unused to such equipment stared at how quickly bulk loads were cleaned. The clatter of drums and the endless tumble of linens looked like something from another world, an industrial answer to a task they had done by hand in muddy streams. Fresh bed linens intensified the shock. Many had slept on wet ground or insect-ridden straw. Now sheets and blankets were rotated regularly and returned faintly perfumed with detergent. For some, the cleanliness was so unfamiliar they struggled to sleep at first, unaccustomed to the absence of filth and pests. What struck them most was the discipline behind it. Guards stressed punctuality. Laundry had to be turned in on time, folded properly and labeled. Miss the rules and you waited longer for your kit. To Americans, that was simply military order. To Japanese POWs, it was a lesson in systems over improvisation. Everything planned, logged, and executed with precision. Laundry rooms also became job sites. Assigned prisoners worked presses, irons, and sorting tables. Men who had marched jungles now spent hours stacking crisp uniforms under supervisors' eyes. Some took quiet pride in mastering the machines. Accounts note small benefits: indoor work, protection from weather, and occasional contact with visiting Red Cross inspectors. The Red Cross helped cement standards. Inspection reports noted barracks hygiene, laundry provisions, and bedding rotation, then circulated internationally as proof of Geneva compliance. Men taught to expect neglect or starvation realized that clean clothing arriving regularly was no accident. It was the product of a deliberate system designed to be seen. The contrast with wartime hardship bit deepest. Visions of steaming laundry halls clashed with memories of scratching lice or wringing out mold-blackened shirts. They had braced for degradation. Instead, even laundry became a tool of discipline, efficiency, and unexpected dignity. While barbers, tailoring, and laundry startled the Japanese on a practical level, the deeper impact played out in their minds. Many had shuffled into captivity with their self-image shattered, certain they had disgraced their families and the emperor by yielding. Yet within the American wire, the steady cadence of washing, trimming, and clean clothing gradually rebuilt pieces of identity they thought were gone forever. For the first time in months, they saw themselves in mirrors, wore garments without holes, and lay down on bedding that didn't stink of decay. Such small details touched the core of how they perceived themselves, not as broken fighters, but as human beings again. For men trained to equate captivity with humiliation, ordered routine produced a bewildering blend of shame and relief. Some pushed back at first, skipping showers, refusing to shave, avoiding the barbers. Guards imposed compliance, but resistance softened with time. Prisoners noticed that a neat appearance changed the tone of interactions. Those who kept to the rules were addressed with less edge, while the unkempt drew reprimand. Strangely, grooming became linked to dignity. Looking disciplined allowed them to reclaim fragments of respect in the eyes of their captors. The effect spread across the group. In crowded barracks, where boredom and despair could spark fights, tidiness proved stabilizing. Men who once snapped out of frustration found fewer reasons to quarrel as conditions improved. Lice receded, illnesses declined, itch and irritation eased, haircuts cut infection risks, health rose and tempers cooled. American officers understood the equation. A healthier, steadier prisoner population meant fewer flashpoints and camps that were easier to run. The contrast with their own military values could not have been starker. Imperial doctrine exalted stoicism. Suffering was noble. Comfort signaled weakness. In US hands, they encountered a contrary philosophy, discipline enforced not by deprivation, but by regulated well-being. The realization unsettled their worldview. If their army glorified endurance even at the cost of health, why did a supposedly decadent enemy achieve control by providing order and necessities? Some began to suspect that American strength lay in pairing structure with provision. Quiet transformations followed. A despondent man might feel a flicker of pride when issued freshly laundered clothes. Another, catching sight of himself after a haircut, recognized a younger version of the person he had been before the war. These moments did not erase bitterness over defeat, but they chipped away at the hopelessness of confinement. Later testimonies note that such simple rituals gave men the mental resilience to endure years behind the wire. Not everyone embraced the routines. Certain officers warned that accepting comfort would dull the fighting spirit drilled into them in Japan. They cautioned against going soft under enemy care. That tension between inherited values and present realities shaped daily life. Even so, the broader effect was plain. Enforced hygiene reshaped habits, calmed tempers, and offered a path through captivity without sliding into despair. What first seemed trivial, clippers snipping, seams repaired, laundry returned in sharp folds, gradually became anchors of identity. The shock of cleanliness gave way to acceptance, and acceptance became a subtle tool for survival. In the camp's quiet order, prisoners discovered that dignity could be reconstructed not by battlefield glory, but through the smallest, most ordinary rituals. Beneath those mundane routines lay a deliberate American approach to managing thousands of enemy combatants on home soil. Barbershops, tailoring rooms, and laundry plants were not charity. They were components of a broader design rooted in US military practice and international law. After lessons from the First World War, when poor treatment bred unrest and criticism, American authorities built a regime where discipline flowed from structure, regulations, and adherence to the Geneva Convention. The central premise was straightforward. Orderly treatment lowered the odds of rebellion. Cleanliness, steady meals, and medical care improved health, which reduced desperation and violence. Officials observed that men who retained some sense of dignity were easier to control than those driven to the edge by hunger and disease. In practical terms, grooming stations and clothing cycles functioned as quiet instruments of pacification. Prisoners absorbed by schedules, inspections, and personal upkeep had less time and energy to plot escapes or provoke disturbances. There was also a public dimension. news about camp conditions did not stay inside the fence. The International Red Cross visited regularly, recorded the state of facilities, interviewed POWs, and filed reports. Showing Japanese prisoners healthy, clothed, and clean undercut enemy propaganda about American barbarity and reassured US citizens that their country upheld standards even in brutal war. Every smooth-shaven face and neat stack of washed uniforms thus fed a wider narrative. Logistics underpinned everything. The US Army managed huge supply chains capable of feeding and equipping millions of its own troops. Extending those systems to captives demanded extra resources, yet also advertised industrial might. Washing machines, sewing stations, and barbers under electric light testified to a nation that could maintain its enemies while fighting on two oceans. For men who had watched their own supply lines wither into scarcity, that abundance read as undeniable power. Labor policy meshed with the philosophy: clean, clothed, reasonably healthy POWs could work. Many camps assigned prisoners to farms, timber crews, or maintenance details. The laundry and tailoring shops doubled as employment, structuring the day and curbing idleness before it fermented into trouble. Such work aided the war economy and transformed potential liabilities into manageable assets. Even architecture reflected the approach. Camps were laid out with functional zones, sanitation blocks, work areas, recreation grounds, living quarters. Separating where men slept, worked, and washed kept movement constant and habits predictable. Guards enforced boundaries, but the system itself carried much of the control. Timetables, rosters, and routes left little space for disruption. To Japanese eyes, the method seemed paradoxical. They expected enemies to break prisoners down into shadows of themselves. Instead, they met a captor convinced that maintaining health and appearance was a means of control. What they could not know then was how deeply this stance was woven into American practice, a blend of pragmatism, legal obligation, and the belief that order, not cruelty, secures victory. When peace finally came and the gates swung open, the memories these men took home did not resemble the scenes they had imagined upon capture. In memoirs and quiet conversations, many described how profoundly barbers, tailors, and laundry crews had altered their picture of the foe. Strength, they concluded, was expressed not only in battle, but in the capacity to impose order, even for captives. Accounts gathered decades later return again and again to specific sensations: the sting of soap on skin long caked in sweat, the shock of being issued mended clothing instead of being left in rags, the hum of industrial washers working through endless loads. Details that Americans barely noticed became indelible to men who had lived scarcity. Veterans recalled that the first night on clean sheets or the first day in a pressed uniform was when they comprehended the gulf between the two militaries' approaches to human needs. The memory left a complicated inheritance. On one side, many admitted they survived partly because of those unexpected systems of care. Diseases that might have killed them in the tropics were checked by hygiene. Despair was eased, however slightly, by the dignity of cleanliness. On the other side, shame lingered. Accepting comfort from an enemy clashed with values drilled into them by the Imperial Army. Some kept silent afterward, fearing family judgment from those who imagined captivity only as suffering. Historians studying Japanese POW narratives note how often such details surface. Oral histories skip grand strategy and return instead to the oddness of queuing for a barber's chair or collecting folded laundry. These images became shorthand for the strangeness of confinement, a world that was organized, efficient, and, in its way, humane within a global war marked by atrocity. Those memories also played a role in reconciliation. As US-Japan exchanges deepened in the decades after the war, some former POWs privately acknowledged that camp routines had complicated propaganda images of America. Cleanliness, order, and regularity softened a caricature of the enemy, revealing a power rooted as much in discipline as in arms. Bitterness did not vanish, especially over the shame of surrender, but in this narrow space, respect sometimes replaced hostility. Modern scholarship still cites barbers, tailoring, and laundry as windows into cultural contrast. To many Japanese, these services highlighted the distance between two creeds, one that exalted sacrifice and scarcity, and another that equated strength with efficiency and care. In captivity, these lessons weren't taught in lectures but lived in the daily cycle of soap, scissors, and stitched seams. Thus, long after release, The men carried home not only the scars of defeat, but also the memory of how American orderliness shaped their confinement. What once seemed unimaginable, being shaved, dressed, and handed clean sheets by an enemy, remained etched as the most enduring shock of all.